Hello students, welcome to Byju's IAS. Welcome to a session on economy this week, wherein we'll be taking up some of the very important articles that have appeared in various business related newspapers and we'll be analyzing these particular articles. For this particular video, I've chosen the time period from 29th of June to 5th July 2020 and the articles that I'll be discussing are from Business Line, Hindu, Business Standard, Indian Express and Live Mint. Let's begin the discussion. The first article is related to the completion of 3 years of the system of GST. To begin with, some of the very important basic points related to GST are: 1. GST stands for Goods and Services Tax. Second, we introduced the idea of a GST or the concept of a GST wherein the indirect taxes, please make a note of this, the indirect taxes would be subsumed. That is, earlier the central government used to impose multiple types of indirect taxes. The states used to impose and collect multiple types of indirect taxes. And beyond this, another issue was different states had different rates of indirect taxes. In order to harmonize the whole system, in order to make the whole indirect taxation system uniform, we introduced the concept of a GST, wherein we are going to subsume all these indirect taxes and we are going to basically frame one nation, one tax. And the term tax here is basically referring to indirect taxes. And beyond this, you must also have heard of one market. This is the objective or the theme of the GST. That is, all throughout India, irrespective of the state, whichever goods is sold, that is, the good which is sold across all the states, the GST rates will be same. For example, a mobile phone either sold in Karnataka or in Tamil Nadu or in Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, the GST rate applicable will be one and the same. And another very important feature of a GST was the dual structure or dual idea of the GST. That is, basically GST will consist of two components, central GST and state GST. And whatever is the rate of GST, the components of CGST and SGST will always be the same. For example, if there is a GST rate of 12%, this particular 12% will be divided into two, that is, the 6% will be CGST and 6% will be SGST. And apart from this, another very important feature of a GST is the SGST component will always go to the state where the consumption of a good happens. That is the precise reason why this particular GST is also referred as a destination based or consumption based taxation. These are some of the very important features with which we launched the GST, and very recently we have completed 3 years of implementation of GST. There has been a lot of discussion as to what has been the evaluation of a GST, and this article basically discusses some of these particular points. In the beginning, as earlier mentioned, we had multiple indirect taxes. With introduction of a GST, we have been able to reduce these number of indirect taxes. Having said so, please make a note of this. Even today, there are certain indirect taxes which are out of the purview of a GST. And there are certain commodities which are under the coverage of GST, but we are not applying the GST on these particular commodities. For example, petroleum products. Even today on petroleum products, the state government as well as the central government is imposing the indirect taxes. So what have been the achievements of GST? What we have achieved in the last 3 years with implementation of GST? First and foremost, we have been able to create a national market. That is, irrespective of the state where the goods are being sold, all these particular goods will be imposed with the single rate of GST. Second, the number of indirect taxes have come down. As per various surveys, more than 30 types of indirect taxes plus cesses have been subsumed under the ambit of GST. That is the second very important achievement. Third, with implementation of GST, the concept of the checkpost at interstate borders has been removed or abolished. Earlier, if a particular truck is basically carrying the goods from one state to another state, it was supposed to stop at the checkpost at interstate borders, provide the documentation, then get into the other state. As a result of this, the time consumption was high, The cost of transportation was high. The turnaround time for the trucks, that is basically the time taken to drop the commodities and come back, was also very high. This also contributed to higher market prices of the commodities. And with introduction of GST, this particular issue of a higher transportation cost to a certain extent has been addressed with abolition of the checkpost at interstate borders. So these are some of the achievements, and the biggest achievement which I have not yet discussed is the idea of a GST Council, which has been heralded as one of the very important or prime examples of cooperative federalism. In case of a GST Council, you will have representation from the center as well as the states. And this particular GST Council is the authority which is the most important body in terms of implementation of GST. The GST Council decides what commodities should be covered under the ambit of a GST, what commodities should be applied with which rate of a GST. If at all there is a dispute, how this particular resolution has to happen, so on and so forth. In simple terms, everything associated with GST will be decided by the GST Council itself. And so far in the last 3 years, though there is a representation from the state as well as the center, the GST Council has done very well in terms of implementation of this particular GST. That is the precise reason majority of the experts are basically recommending the same concept in order to address wherever there are disputes between center and state. So these are some of the achievements. Having said so, even today there are certain issues related to the GST. That is, despite completing 3 years, there are certain problems or concerns which are plaguing the implementation of GST. What are these? First and foremost, the number of slabs or tariffs. The whole idea of a GST was what? One nation, one indirect tax. But under the ambit of a GST, we have slabs such as 0%, 5%, 12%, 18%, and 28%. And beyond this also there are many more slabs. The whole central theme of a GST has been defeated by having multiple types of slab rates. So the government, or to be more precise, the GST Council has to look into it and try to address these particular slab or the different rates of GST. Because more the slabs, more the confusion, more the problem for the taxpayers in the market. In majority of the countries which have implemented GST very effectively, usually you will see one standard rate of GST, and in addition to one standard rate of GST, there will be one or two more slabs. But in case of India, we have a plethora of the GST rates. That is the precise reason various experts even today criticize GST as old wine in a new bottle. That is to say that earlier there were different indirect taxes with different names, but today there is only one name but different rates even today exist. So Government of India has to look into this. Having said so, you will also have to remember this. Do we need rationalization of the slabs? Definitely yes. But can we do it today? Can we do it in the present context where the GST revenues are very, very low? The whole Indian economy is facing recessionary trends. Can we go for rationalization? It is not possible now. So in short term, can we do this? Not possible in the present context, but definitely after certain number of years, you will have to look into this. Second issue has been tax evasion in the GST. One of the important objectives of introduction of GST was, under the earlier indirect taxation regime, there was a huge amount of a tax evasion. That is, people who are earning or making certain sales, earning incomes, they are not paying the right amount of indirect taxes. So there was a huge amount of a tax evasion. Government, while introducing GST, basically stated that with introduction of GST, some of the issues of tax evasion will be countered. But it has been seen that with introduction of GST also, even today, there is a tax evasion that has been happening under the ambit of GST. I am pretty sure you must have heard of the briefcase companies or fake bills or receipts. As a result of this, the amount of a GST which should be collected by the government is higher, but how much it is actually collecting is much, much lesser. So even today, there is a problem with respect to revenue collection under the ambit of GST. And third, the filing system filing of GST returns even today is problem. In the last 3 years itself, the GST Council has issued multiple changes or multiple measures have been introduced with respect to the filing of GST returns. Having said so, even today, one of the issues that is plaguing the GST is filing the returns under the ambit of GST. Apart from this, another issue is some of the exempted commodities. As already mentioned, some of the commodities are not covered under the ambit of a GST. Some of the commodities are covered in the GST, but we are yet to issue the GST rates which are applicable to these particular commodities. So you cannot have a GST without subsuming all the indirect taxes. Or in other ways, I can say that you cannot have a parallel system of GST as well as some other indirect taxes running. So all these particular indirect taxes will have to be brought under the ambit of a GST. Only then the GST in true form will be one nation, one indirect tax. So these are some of the issues which are plaguing, which have to be seen by the government or GST Council, and these particular issues will have to be addressed. So this is the basic discussion related to the evaluation of 3 years of implementation of GST. Based on this particular discussion that we have had so far, I have given you a straightforward question. That is, though GST has completed 3 years of implementation, there is a long way to go before it becomes a good and simple tax. You will have to elaborate this particular statement in 250 words. Now let me go to the next article. RBI sets rules for liquidity scheme. Now what is this article regarding? First and foremost, in recent times, you have seen that the NBFCs as well as the housing finance companies are facing a lot of financial issues. The issue related to the financial distress in the NBFC sector started with the default by IL&FS, and post that, one after the other, there have been certain issues which have been plaguing these particular sectors. And to address this particular financial pressure in the NBFCs as well as HFCs, government has announced a special liquidity scheme, and the article discusses basically about this particular SLS. Second point, why specifically in this particular time period this SLS scheme has been announced? That is, what prompted the government to announce this particular scheme? The scheme was announced because RBI announced loan moratorium. That is, under this, initially it was for 3 months but later extended to 6 months. The borrowers are given an option of postponing their payments. I am using the term postponing for a simple reason. If I was a borrower here and I was supposed to make a payment, let's say in the month of March, and this particular concept of a loan moratorium which has been announced by RBI is applicable from March to August for a period of 6 months. So in the month of March, let's say I am supposed to make a payment or EMI payment of 10,000 rupees. And if I opt for this particular loan moratorium, then for the next 6 months, whatever is the EMI payment, I will not be paying, but after the moratorium period is over, I'll be making the repayment. I can understand the idea here. It is not cancellation, it is only postponement. What is the basic difference? In case of cancellation, this 10,000 rupees will not be paid. I will not be paying this particular 10,000 rupees. For example, in case of a loan waiver. But what has been done here is not a loan waiver, it is a loan moratorium, which means rather than paying in the month of March, April, May, June, July, August, after the 6 month time period is over, I'll be making these particular repayments again. So what has essentially been done is postponing the repayments, not the cancellation. But understand this very carefully. If I was supposed to make a payment of 10,000 rupees, imagine your NBFC, I was supposed to make a payment of 10,000 rupees to you people, and I choose not to make the payment, and rather I will make the payment after 6 months time period. Don't you think for 6 months you will not be collecting this particular 10,000 rupees monthly? That is, 60,000 rupees will not be collected by you people. But on the other hand, you would have borrowed some amount from someone else. For example, NBFCs will borrow from banking sector and will lend in the market. So if these particular borrowers do not make the payment and hold the payment for, let's say, for 6 months time period, from where do you think the NBFC will have the money to pay for their lenders? So there was a danger that this will lead to a contagion effect or a spillover effect. The banking sector will also face certain issues because of this. In order to address this particular liquidity or the financial issue that would be faced by the NBFCs and housing finance companies, Government of India announced this particular concept of special liquidity scheme. Now this particular special liquidity scheme is very technical in nature. Please follow the discussion very carefully. Now what has been done under this? First and foremost, a special purpose vehicle has been set up. This particular SPV has been set up by SBI Capital, and to this particular SBI Capital, government would be infusing an initial capital of around 5 crore rupees. Now what is the importance of this particular SPV? The importance is this particular SPV will be issuing certain securities which will be purchased by RBI. Follow the process here very carefully. This SPV will be issuing securities and these particular securities will be purchased by RBI. In essence, the money will be flowing from RBI to this particular SPV, which is SBI Cap. Now this money will be used by SBI Cap to purchase certain securities in the market. What kind of securities? The SBI Cap will be using the amount that is collected, that is 30,000 crore rupees from RBI, to purchase securities such as NCDs, non-convertible debentures and commercial papers. This is the first very important point you will have to note. That is, 1. SBI Cap will be selling the securities to RBI, collect 30,000 crores from RBI, use it to purchase securities from the primary market or secondary market, which are either NCDs, non-convertible debentures and commercial papers. Second point, these securities that will be purchased will not have a maturity period of more than 3 months. Third point, these particular securities which will be purchased by SBI Cap will be from NBFCs, HFCs, but here is a condition. These NBFCs, HFCs should not have defaulted on the repayment. That is, they should not have been declared as a non-performing asset. But more importantly, the guidelines say that they should not even be classified as a special mention account 1 and 2. Now what do you mean by special mention account type 1 and type 2? Let me take an example, you will understand it better. Imagine you are a bank and I am a borrower. I have taken a loan from you people and I am supposed to make monthly repayments. Now imagine for this particular month, that is, let's say for the month of July, I have not made the repayment. So on 1st of July, I was supposed to make the repayment, I have not made the repayment. So if I don't make the repayment, that is basically if I have defaulted from 1st day to 30th day, then I will be classified as a special mention account class 0. I can understand this. If the default period is up to 30 days, then I'll be classified as a special mention account 0. And if the default period crosses more than 30, that is from 31st day to 60th day, then I'll be classified as a special mention account type 1. And if the default crosses 60th day, that is from 61st day to 90th day, then I'll be classified as a special mention account type 2. I'll repeat again, the NBFCs or HFCs from whom these particular securities will be purchased by this particular SPV should not be classified as a special mention account 1, special mention account 2. In essence, if they have defaulted, the default period should not have crossed more than 30 days. That is another very important condition. Next, these particular NBFCs or HFCs who will be participating or whose securities will be sold to the SPV, they should not have an NPA of more than 6%. But please make a point here. Though I said these particular authorities or NBFCs or HFCs should not be classified as SMA1, SMA2, this is only applicable for a period of 1 year before 1st of August 2018. So before this period, that is 1 year before this particular time period, they should not be classified as SMA1, SMA2. Next, these particular NBFCs and HFCs should not have an NPA of more than 6% as of 31st March of 2019. Next very important guideline, the capital adequacy ratio of NBFCs and HFCs should be 15% and 12%. Below this, these will not be covered under this particular special liquidity scheme. And last very important guideline with respect to availing the SLS is that the securities, that is NCDs and CPs, which will be purchased by this SPV should be of investment grade. That is basically, in case of a concept of a credit rating, the ratings are divided into two heads. One is called as a speculative grade or junk grade, and the second one is called as investment grade. Generally, those particular instruments which will be classified as investment grade, the safety will be comparatively higher. And in case of those particular securities which will have a classification of speculative grade, the risk is very, very high. So these particular NCDs and CPs which will be purchased by the SPV should be graded under the investment grade. So these are the guidelines which have been issued in terms of this particular special liquidity scheme. Now let's evaluate this particular scheme. Now understand this. The liability in this particular NBFC and HFC sector is said to be more than 60,000 crore rupees. That is, these particular institutions will have a huge amount of a debt repayment liability in the coming days. The amount which has been provided under this particular scheme will not be sufficient. That is the first one. Second, many of the experts or the stakeholders expected much bigger benefit, and the duration should have been much higher. That is basically, they are saying that they wanted the benefit which will last for, let's say, 2 years or 3 years. Whereas the SLS which has been announced by the government, the SP will be purchasing these particular instruments with a maturity period of only up to 3 months. That is the precise reason various experts have stated that this particular scheme is like an umbrella in the storm. The NBFC and HFC sector are facing huge amount of a credibility issue, huge amount of a financial pressure. In these particular situations, this particular relief which has been provided will not be sufficient. So these are some of the points related to this particular special liquidity scheme which has been announced for the NBFCs and HFCs. Let me take up the next article here. It is based on the bilateral investment treaties. First and foremost, what is this particular BIT? We'll look into that, then we'll take up what points have been given in this particular article. Now imagine there are two countries A and B. Now from country A, there is a company X. This particular company will make an investment in country B. That is, let's say, example of FDI, foreign direct investment. Now what if the government in country B suddenly changes its policy? Or what if the ministries which are part of the government make it very difficult, change the guidelines very often, as a result of which the investments by a foreign company will take a hit? And what if a judiciary in country B, that is a Supreme Court in country B, basically changes the guideline or cancels the licenses which have been given to the foreign companies which are operating in country B? Now in all these cases, don't you think the investments done by the foreign companies will get affected? The best case in point in the current situation in India will be the cancellation of a 2G spectrum. The Supreme Court of India cancelled multiple spectrum licenses which were issued to not only the domestic companies but also to the foreign companies. Now what about the investments done by these particular foreign companies? Don't you think these investments will be affected by these kind of policies or decisions or judicial orders? Definitely yes. In order to protect the interest of these kind of investors or foreign companies, generally these countries enter into agreement. These agreements are referred to as bilateral investment treaties. Is it okay? I'll repeat it again. In order to protect the investors and to strengthen the trade, strengthen the relations between these two trading partners, these two trading partners will enter into an agreement. This is referred to as a bilateral investment treaty. But on what basis this particular treaty will be signed? Individual countries will formulate their own model BIT, Model Bilateral Investment Treaty, based on which India will conduct the trade negotiations, enter into agreement with its trading partners. The latest BIT which has been signed between India and the other country is with Brazil, which has happened in the year 2020 itself. Please make a note of this. Now, under this particular BIT, both these countries will enter into an agreement. If one country suddenly changes its policy or the decision of the government there affects the investments of the foreign companies, then there will be a resolution of these particular issues. How the resolution is done is also given in the BIT. Now this has been one of the very important concern with respect to the model BIT of India 2016, which I'll come to it later. Now, what has been the genesis of BIT in India? The first model BIT was framed in India in the year 1993, and after the formulation of a BIT, the first BIT that India entered into was with the United Kingdom in 1994. And please make a note of this. And this particular BIT was repealed or basically abolished in the year 2017. That is post 2016, after the introduction of a model BIT, more than 60 such BITs which India had with multiple countries has been withdrawn, and that has been one of the very important concerns. Now, come to what has been discussed in this particular article. First and foremost, in recent times we have seen that Indian economy from having a slowdown is entering into a recessionary phase. Various experts, even international organizations have stated that Indian economy is going to contract in the coming year. This is one of the very important concerns. Now, how do you come out of this particular slowdown or recessionary trend? You will have to increase the investments. The household consumption has to be increased. But there is a concern here, that is, if Government of India wants to invest in the market, it doesn't have sufficient money. If it wants to borrow from the market, the fiscal deficit is overshooting. This is also becoming a problem for the government to infuse money in the households or to put money in the hands of the consumers. Because please understand, growth can be achieved in multiple ways. One way is what? Government, or let's say the market, will invest heavily, manufacturing facility will be set up, infrastructure will be developed, employment will be generated, salaries which are flowing to the households will increase, the demand for goods and services will increase, production will increase. That is one way to achieve growth. And what is the other way? Government will directly give money in the hands of the households in the form of, let's say, increased Manrega wages, increase the subsidies, reduction in income tax rates, so on and so forth. And once this money is flowing into the households, the consumption of goods and services in the market will increase. In essence, a demand for goods and services which has increased will lead to more production, more employment, that will lead to a higher GDP growth rate. So, GDP can be achieved in multiple ways. But in case of India right now, with respect to investment, Government of India doesn't have sufficient amount. What about the consumption-led growth? Can Government of India give or transfer money in the hands of the consumers which will lead to growth? That is also not possible. Why? Government doesn't have money. And why I'm focused on the households? For a simple reason. 60% of the consumption demand in the market is because of the households themselves. So government is facing a lot of issues with respect to how to revive the GDP growth rate. So one way to achieve this particular revival of GDP will be by attracting foreign investments. In the form of what? Best example, in the form of foreign direct investments, where foreign companies will come into India, invest in, let's say, services sector, invest in manufacturing, invest in development of various infrastructure, so on and so forth. But one of the issues that is plaguing the inflow of a foreign direct investment or overall foreign investment into India is the model BIT, Bilateral Investment Treaty. As earlier mentioned, Government of India formed a model BIT in the year 2016, and post 2016, with this particular model BIT in the hindsight or in the background, government has basically withdrawn, has abolished more than 60 BITs which it has signed with multiple countries over a period of time. Though on one side, India's ranking in the ease of doing business is improving, please understand, the foreign companies which will come into India and invest will not look at only the ease of doing business ranking. And even if they look at ease of doing business ranking, overall ranking has improved, no doubt. But there are certain parameters even under ease of doing business ranking wherein India fares very poorly. Under this, India's ranking is 163rd out of 190 countries. That is basically in terms of enforcement of contracts, India's ranking is very, very poor. Not just this. In case in the enforcement of contract there is a dispute, it takes around 1445 days for having a dispute resolution, and the value which will be, that is basically the expenditure incurred for having a dispute resolution, is more than 30% of the value of the project. So you can see that on one side the ranking is improving, but in some of the very important parameters India's performance is very, very poor. And this has been one issue which is affecting the inflow of the foreign investments. No doubt, India is one of the biggest recipient of the foreign investments. But when you compare the inflow of the investments, that is the foreign investments in a country such as China, and compare that with India, it is said that India's FDI accounts for around 2% of GDP. That is, overall foreign investments is around 2% of the GDP, which is much lesser, even lesser than the in remittances or the forex remittances that India receives. Now, what has been the issue? Issue has been that post 2016, or the BIT which was introduced in 2016 is more protectionist. That is, the government has formulated a BIT in such a way that it is more worried about the domestic interest or the interests of the government rather than addressing the concerns of the foreign investors. For example, one of the provisions related to definition of investments. Government of India has reduced the coverage of types of investments which will be covered under the BIT. As a result of this, many of these kinds of investments or foreign investors who are making investments in India will not be covered under the protection given by BIT. Now, if you are a foreign investor, you want to invest in India, and the type of investment that you are doing is not covered or is not protected under the BIT, on what basis will you make an investment? That is one issue. A second issue has been with respect to the dispute resolution mechanism. Take the same example, you are a foreign investor, you want to invest in India. Now, imagine your investment is protected under the BIT, but what if there is a dispute between you and the government? How this particular dispute resolution will be done? In case there is such a dispute, as per the new model of a BIT, the resolution initially has to be done in the domestic territory itself. That is, you as a foreign investor will have to try out all the available recourse that is there in the domestic market. That is, first go to the respective court, file the case there, then take it to High Court, then maybe take it to Supreme Court. Once you exhaust all the domestic routes which are available for the dispute resolution, only then you can go for international arbitration. Various investors are worried about even this particular clause, and this has been one of the reasons why the bilateral agreement between India and the UK, or to be more precise, the Britain, is stuck up right now. So these are some of the issues which are basically making it very difficult for India to enter into agreements with other countries, attract foreign investments in order to revive or in order to contribute highly to the growth. So this is the discussion related to this particular article. Based on this, there is a question. Consider the following statements about BIT. India signed its first BIT with United Kingdom and has terminated that in 2017. Correct statement. India's first BIT was framed in 1993. It is also correct. So the right option will be option 3. Both are true. So based on this discussion, I have given a question here. Consider the following statements about BITs. India signed its first BIT with the United Kingdom and has terminated it in 2017. Correct. India's first BIT was framed in 1993. Correct. So both the statements are correct. Right option will be option C. Both are true. I have also given a descriptive question here. One way of coming out of the slowing growth is by attracting foreign investments. In this regard, discuss the importance and issues related to BIT, Bilateral Investment Treaty in India, in 250 words. The next article is related to white label ATMs. Now, what do you mean by white label ATMs? Generally, we see that the banks in India will be involved in one or the other way in operation of ATMs. For example, in case of in-house ATMs, you will see that the banks will take care of, that is the sponsor bank will take care of all the aspects related to functioning of an ATM. That is, be it purchasing of the ATM machine or taking it on lease, placing it in a particular place, maintaining the function of this particular ATM, ensuring there's a refilling of money, so on and so forth. So generally we see that banks are usually involved in the functioning of these particular ATMs in one or the other way. But in case of white label ATMs, this is a special type of ATM for a simple reason. These are operated by non-banking entities. The best way to define the white label ATMs is simply to say that these are the ATMs which are operated or functioned by the non-banking entities. Right? For example, there is a Muthoot which operates these particular white label ATMs, and there is a Tata which operates these particular white label ATMs. So basically these are the non-banking entities which are operating or basically ensuring these particular ATMs function. They will take care of a refilling of the money. They will take care of the transactions which will happen in these particular ATMs. They will also take care of leasing these particular ATM machines, so on and so forth. That is, in simple terms, all the functions related to functioning of these particular ATMs will be handled by these entities only. Now, how these particular ATMs will operate? Imagine you hold a card of, let's say, either the debit or credit card of SBI. You go to this particular white label ATM and you operate or conduct a transaction. It could be a cash based transaction or a non-cash based transaction. Now, once you complete the transaction, the bank which has issued the card to you will be paying certain amount to this particular white label ATM operator. In case of the cash based transaction, it is 18 rupees. In case of a non-cash based transaction, it is 8 rupee per transaction. This is how the white label ATMs will operate. And in addition to this, white label ATMs will also provide huge amount of value added services also. Now, what has been given in this particular article? The white label ATMs were promoted by RBI in order to ensure that the penetration of the banking points or the financial service points will increase in the rural market, not only urban India but also in rural India. But what has happened in the recent times? The functioning of the white label ATMs has not been satisfactory. That has been the point of discussion in this particular article. First and foremost, with more and more digital payment service providers, that is more and more emergence of digital payment services, the utilization of ATM services has actually come down. But please understand, within this also, the majority hit has been taken by white label ATMs. Why? Please understand this. Generally, in case of white label ATMs, the number of transactions are very, very less. Question is, why these transactions are very less? The answer is that whenever you want to operate your SBI card, or for that matter, the card which has been given by any bank, your faith in the ATMs will be higher if you can see the symbol or the logo of the sponsoring bank. For example, if I tell you that you are going to conduct an ATM transaction, in one of the ATM kiosk, there is a logo of SBI, and in another ATM kiosk, there is some logo, definitely of a company, but you do not know or do not recognize this particular company. So, of these two ATMs, from which ATM would you prefer to conduct the transaction? I'm pretty sure most of you will prefer to go to the first ATM where the bank's logo is displayed. The number of footfalls or number of transactions in these particular ATMs where there is a displaying of the logo of the bank, the number of footfalls are very, very high. The transactions which are conducted in this particular ATM also very, very high. 60% of the transactions are basically conducted in these kind of ATMs only. So the number of transactions are very, very less in the first place in these particular white label ATMs. That is the first issue. Second, since the free transactions, that is beyond number of transactions in a month, the bank will be charging you certain amount of the charges. So since there is a limited number of free transactions per month, what people do is basically when they are withdrawing money, they will try to withdraw a large value of money. And what is the problem with that? The problem is if that is done in a white label ATM, don't you think the machine will run out of the cash very soon? The time or the number of deposits which will be done in this particular white ATM labels will be very, very high, which also means the cost of operation of white label ATM is higher. So the cost of operations are high, number of transactions conducted in the white label ATMs are generally low, have become much lesser because of emergence of digital payment systems. Third, interchange payments. Now what is this particular interchange payments? Earlier I gave an example of you using an SBI card in one of these particular white label ATMs, and I said because you have conducted a transaction, SBI will pay certain amount to this particular white label ATM operator. This money which is paid by the issuer of the card, I repeat the statement, this charge or money which is paid by the issuer of the card to the white label ATM operator is called as interchange payment. This particular interchange payment has been fixed in the year 2012 and has not been changed post that. Various operators of white label ATMs are requesting RBI to make a change in this particular interchange charges for a simple reason: the cost of handling the cash, the cost of operations, all of them have kept on increasing post 2012. But the interchange charges have been fixed at that particular year itself. So this is another issue which is plaguing the functioning of white label ATMs. and these are discussed in this particular article. Now based on this, I've given a question here. Consider the following statements about white label ATMs. White label ATMs are allowed to be set up under the Payment and Settlement Systems Act of 2007, correct? The interchange fees is paid by the card issuing bank to RBI, wrong. It is paid by the issuer of the card to the white label ATM where you have operated using this particular card. So first statement is correct. Option A is the right option. So these are some of the articles as well as the questions related to these particular articles for this particular time period. Thank you. Have a good day.